My book is the first traditional historical novel about Frederick Douglass since 1947, the year of my birth. Using a popular literary genre, I hope to introduce Frederick Douglass to a wide audience and deepen our understanding of a remarkable man by revealing his complexity and contradictions. He lived a long life from 1818 to 1895, rich with incident, rich with drama, and the possibility of a life well lived. I discovered Frederick Douglass when I was in college, and his life was so dramatic, I wanted to read a book about him. And the first book I read was a book called There Once Was a Slave, The Heroic Story of Frederick Douglass by Shirley Graham. It was published in 1947, and as I read it, I became more and more dissatisfied. I became dissatisfied because it made Frederick Douglass into a saint, an icon without flaw. And I, at the time, thought I could write a better book. I hoped that one day, when the opportunity came, that I would be able to write that book. Meanwhile, after years of research and writing, I discovered a review of that book by the great American writer, James Baldwin. And this is what James Baldwin wrote in an essay for The Nation in 1947. There's a tradition among emancipated whites and progressive Negroes to the effect that no unpleasant truth concerning Negroes is ever to be told, a tradition as crippling and insidious as that other tradition that Negroes are never to be characterized as anything more than a moral laughing clowns. Frederick Douglass was first of all a man, honest within the limitations of his character and his time, quite frequently misguided, sometimes pompous, gifted but not always a hero, and no saint at all. Miss Graham, in her frenzied efforts to make him a symbol of freedom and an example of what the Negro race can produce, has reduced a significant, passionate human being to the obscene level of a Hollywood caricature. That is a pretty harsh condemnation of a book, but it was a clarion call to me that if I wrote a book about Frederick Douglass, it should reveal his immense personality, but also the complexity of that personality, the contradictions, the flaws. Because it is my belief that great iconic figures like Frederick Douglass can still inspire us and move us, despite their limitations, despite their flaws. I decided that when the time came, I would write that book, showing Frederick Douglass from multiple points of view, multiple angles, to reveal that complexity. I wrote this novel over a period of 40 years. I wrote the first version when I was a teacher of history in high school. And that first version was finished in 1978. And I wrote it by hand and before computers. And when I hired someone to type the manuscript, it turned out it was 1,300 pages. There was so much I wanted to say about Frederick Douglass, I wrote that much. Then I reached out to agents in the Los Angeles area, where I am from. And I took the list of agents and I wrote letters to as many as I could from A to Z, and one literary agent replied. And she said, "You write very good letters. Could you send me a sample of your writing?" And I sent the first chapter. And then she said, after a few days, she said, "Can I have another chapter?" And then another time she said, "More," and I sent 5. And then finally she said, "Can you bring the whole book?" And I brought the whole book. It was in a huge box. And when I drove up to her office on Sunset Boulevard, discovering that it was a major literary agency and publishing authors like Aldous Huxley and others, I was stunned. And then when I went inside and met her, her first reaction was, "Oh, this is long," but she said, "I'm still going to read it," and she read it, and her name was Kimberly Cameron, and I thank her in the acknowledgement section of my book, and I thanked her for taking me on, and she said, "You have a talent, and I want to promote your book," which was called North Star. All the rejection letters that I received during that period of time verify that I did excellent research, that I wrote well, but here was the problem. Most of the publishers said the story of Frederick Douglass was irrelevant, no one cared, no one was interested in slavery or the abolitionist movement. Well, that was the response. And I was shocked, but it's what I had to accept. So I put the book aside and became more involved in becoming a school principal. I was an elementary, middle school, and high school principal in Southern California. I was first a teacher of high school history and English composition, and then I became an assistant principal and a principal. And I even got so involved in administration and the politics of administration, I eventually became elected to the presidency of the entire state California Administrators Association. But what happened even during that time was I still could not deny the power of Frederick Douglass's life. And so I decided to return to Frederick Douglass and try again. So I wrote a revision of the book. And Kimberly was still advocating for the book, and she tried again, and the reaction was still the same. No one will be interested, this is not the time, etc. Continued thinking, well, his time will come, let me put it aside, and she suggested I write another novel. And so I wrote another novel based on the life of a young woman who was murdered in 1836 New York. And it was a specific case of the murder of a prostitute killed allegedly by her client, who was the son of a wealthy family. So I wrote that book called City of Desire, and I've always I learned a lot about the limitations placed on women in the 1830s, and this trial turned out to be the most popular trial in the history of New York City. And there was a transcript of the trial, and also the bounty of finding that she wrote hundreds of letters to her clients. And using all that material, I wrote that book. And although the book was published and received good reviews, it didn't go very well. It didn't go far in terms of sales. But there was still within me this eagerness to write about Frederick Douglass. And after I retired from a school administration, I wrote my third version of Frederick Douglass's life. And this time, the third time was the charm. After 40 years, it seems to be taking, has legs. It seems to be resonating with folks, helped, I believe, by some of the great work by historians in the past few years. For example, David Blight's book, Prophet of Freedom, which won the Pulitzer Prize. And also the 200th anniversary of Frederick Douglass's birth. He was born in 1818, and 200 years later, there's been a lot of celebrations of Frederick Douglass. So I think his time has come. And so my book, Frederick Douglass, a novel, I think speaks to our time and to the recognition that Frederick Douglass is a preeminent figure of American history. So I am now currently on a book tour. And I've just been thrilled and feel privileged that the Rochester Public Library invited me to talk about this man who moved to Rochester in 1847. And he moved here because he wanted to establish himself as an independent thinker in the life of anti-slavery and in human rights. I'll tell you briefly that experience without giving you a detailed history lesson, but I want you to know that because he came to Rochester, his life changed fundamentally. As you may know, Frederick Douglass was born on the eastern shore of Maryland, and today, when I'm giving this talk, the town of Easton, where Frederick Douglass was born, and the town where he was jailed, where he was jailed for trying to escape, this very day, they're having a full-day celebration with parades and picnics and musical events. That, to me, is an astonishing development in the history of Frederick Douglass, because now he is recognized for the amazing life that he led. Just imagine, not just imagine, we know that here's a man who was born a slave, escapes and becomes the most famous black man in the world, writing books, editing newspapers, giving speeches, advising presidents, and returns to Maryland, where he was born, to reunite with his former enslavers. And I felt, then as I felt now, who can resist such a great adventure story? It is an amazing life that he led. And he led it based on the presumption that he was special. And he learned from early on that he had a life that needed to be lived on his own terms. And he was born in a system whose message was, no, you are not who you want to be, you are what we say you are. And that was a culture of enslavement that was based on white supremacy and suppression of individual rights. And Frederick Douglass had a life that was influenced by many, many people. So I organized my novel around those lives. Novels are essentially about characters. And those characters are the ones who readers of historical fiction tell me they want to know more and more about. Now, when I was young, I wanted to write a version of Frederick Douglass's life that was like his own versions of his life. Frederick Douglass wrote 3 autobiographies. The first, in 1845, narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave. Then 1855, while he was here in Rochester, My Bondage and My Freedom. And then finally, in 1881, when he was living in Washington, Life and Times of Frederick Douglass. These are autobiographies. One was short, the other 2 are very long. From all accounts, very few people have read those 2 books, but they are very detailed. However, and they're the basis of my research and life of Frederick Douglass. But in the beginning, when I first wrote a version of Frederick Douglass's life, I wrote a 4th autobiography. That is, I wrote a novel from his point of view only, and speaking in the I voice. But over the years, as I studied Frederick Douglass's life, I noticed more and more the impact of other people on his life, and I myself felt that those lives had to be told as well. And therefore, it was essential for me that we recognize that even great men are not self-made men. And he himself, in giving a speech about the self-made man, he said that men seldom see themselves as others see them. And again, he said, there are moments in the lives of most men when the doors of their souls are open, and unconsciously to themselves, their true characters may be read by the observant eye. Well, who were those observant eyes? Who helped to reveal the Douglas as he was. I believe that when I decided to write a novel based on the characters in Frederick Douglass's life with their backstories, that I would tell a more cohesive, but also a more a grander vision of the multiple aspects of Frederick Douglass's personality and history. And so I wrote a book that is a multiple point of view book. And it's a multiple point of view book because I wanted to free the reader from the control that Frederick Douglass wanted to have over his narrative. If you read his 3 books, you will notice, for example, some glaring omissions. Omissions about his private life, his domestic life. For example, he had a wife. His first wife was Anna Murray. She was 5 years older than Douglass when they met and married. They were married for 44 years. She was illiterate. She never learned to read or write. And yet he calls her the pillar of his life. And yet in over 3 books, 2 of which were longer than 500 pages, in 3 books he gave her a total of 3 sentences. Those 3 sentences struck me as odd, and also it gave me a sense, what is this about? Why did he not talk about her? Was he trying to protect his domestic life and privacy, or was there something else in play? He rarely talks about his children. He had 5. And he rarely talks about his friends, especially his female friends, who he worked with and who lived in his home during the course of his life. So I wrote a book about the characters in Frederick Douglass's life so that you can determine what influence they had on that life. And so what you will discover in my novel about Frederick Douglass, and it is a novel, I am making no claim that this is the absolute truth, because novelists can imagine scenes that historians cannot. Historians can only make claims based on documentation. Now, fortunately for us as writers, historians, and biographers and novelists, Douglass's life was very well documented. His public life was very well documented. Frederick Douglass wrote millions of words. He gave thousands of speeches. He believed in the power of language. And language transformed his life. Really, it transformed his life. To the point that when he wrote his first book, after being accused of not being a legitimate slave because he was so eloquent and effective in the use of language, he wrote a book to prove that he was an authentic slave. And because of the details in that book, he was forced to flee the country. So language does make a difference. His book is, I think, a masterpiece of writing, and it's probably the greatest autobiography of the 19th century. But in that book, as well in my book, there are persons, characters that stand out. And these are the characters that you will meet as you read these chapters that go from character to character. One of the first you will meet, besides Frederick, is Betsy Bailey. She was his grandmother, who raised him blissfully ignorant of his condition of slavery. And he lived with her, ignorant of his enslavement, for 6 years. She had 5 daughters and several grandchildren who rotated in and out of her cabin and lived on other farms. Only Frederick was allowed to stay with her. And then one day she woke him up in the August of 1824 for a walk 15 miles east to a huge plantation, and she left him there without warning or explanation. Why did she do this? Was Frederick traumatized? Read my book and find out. I can imagine for a 6-year-old raised by his grandmother to be suddenly taken from a small farm near the Tuckahoe River and taken to a plantation, wide plantation, of almost 1,000 slaves, and not know anything about it and be left. Must have been a traumatizing experience. and Frederick Douglass's life was impacted by that. But who was Betsy Bailey, and why did she do what she did? Then you will meet Captain Aaron Anthony. He was the chief overseer or executive manager of Y Plantation, the largest estate on the eastern shore of Maryland. Anthony was Frederick's master and owner. It was whispered he was Frederick's father. Frederick Douglass himself, in his first book, says, "My father was a white man." Was this man, Aaron Anthony, his father? What impact did he have on this 6-year-old, especially when he witnessed Aaron Anthony whipping Frederick's Aunt Hester because she was caught sleeping with another slave? Read my book to find out about Aaron Anthony. Then you will encounter Colonel Edward Lloyd and his family. Lloyd owned Y Plantation, which is still standing on the eastern shore and in the private hands of the family still. And he selected Frederick to be the companion of his youngest son, Daniel. Why did he do that? Surrounded by the splendor of Y Plantation, Frederick lived there for only 2 years, but he spent the rest of his life talking about his experiences and what it told him about the nature of enslavement. Then he returned to Y House in 1879 as a distinguished visitor, received by the direct descendants of Colonel Lloyd. Did Y House and the Lloyd family affect Frederick's sense of self as a man of property and standing? And again, asking the question, why did he return to Maryland? When he said, I loved Maryland, but I loved freedom more. Read my book, please, and I hope you'll be able to answer that question. Then you will meet Sophia Old. Sophia Old was someone who is essential in Frederick's life because she taught him the foundations of reading. When Frederick was sent to Baltimore as a loan, she taught him his letters because she was a religious woman and she wanted him to read the Bible. But when she learned that reading was illegal, teaching a slave reading was illegal, and her husband was really very upset with her, she tried to hide newspapers and books, but her fear revealed the power of words. Her fear showed Frederick that language was important, and so from that moment, he dedicated his life to the power of language. He, in fact, even stole biscuits from Sophia and went out on the streets and offered biscuits to young boys on the streets of Baltimore to identify words on signs and on walls. Yet years later, when slavery was abolished in 1864, Frederick returned to see her. Why? Read my book and find out why. Next, you will meet Anna Murray. She was a free black woman who was 5 years older than Frederick, and she decides to help him escape. And that put her in legal danger, but she helped him escape, and they married in New York in that same year of 1838. She helped him escape. She stayed with him for years, and yet she had to deal with the fact that Frederick Douglass had friends who he insisted lived in his house while he lived in both the house here in Rochester and the house in Washington. Question, and rumors swirled about these women. Who was Anna Murray? And how did she deal with these relationships that Frederick insisted upon having? Then you will meet Julia Griffiths. She was an English woman who eventually came to Rochester to help Frederick start his newspaper. She helped to raise money. She helped to even publish books that included Frederick's speeches. And she was with him when he was attacked on the streets of New York. And she stayed with him for several years until she returned. Was she in love with Frederick Douglass? Did they become lovers? How did Anna Douglass feel about Julia living in her house? Then there was another woman. that Douglas rarely mentions in his books, but her name is Ottilia Assing, and she was a German journalist who came to America hoping to meet Frederick Douglass, and explicitly in her letters to her sister said that Frederick Douglass was her true husband and that he would eventually leave Anna, his wife, and marry her. For more than 20 years, she came every summer to Rochester to live in the South Avenue house. And when he went to the New York area for speeches and meetings, he stayed with her. Why were they lovers? And how and why did Anna deal with Attilia's annual visits? Read my book, please, to find out. It's an intriguing story. Then I want you to know about Elizabeth Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, products of upstate New York, who invited Frederick Douglass to the first Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls, in this area. He was the only black person there, and is one of the few men willing to sign his name to a document calling for the right of women to vote. And his newspaper itself, copies of which are here at the library, said, "Right is of no sex." Unfortunately, Frederick Douglass and Elizabeth Stanton and Susan B. Anthony became bitter enemies because Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Stanton insisted that the 15th Amendment, ratified in 1870, give the right to vote to both men and women. And Frederick Douglass at the time was more practical, and he said, if they're giving it to us now, to men, one day it will come to women as well. The 20th Amendment did not come till 1920, so it was a long wait. But Frederick Douglass was very much committed to equality. It's just that he also became to recognize that sometimes you have to compromise, sometimes you have to work in the system, and sometimes you should not make perfection the enemy of the good. A couple of more characters I will tell you about before I'm going to read you a passage from the book that takes place here in Rochester involving Frederick Douglass and his daughter, Rosetta. The other character I would like you to know about, thank you for coming, Helen Pitts. His second wife was his secretary in the office of the Recorder of Deeds in Washington, D.C. They secretly married after the death of Frederick Douglass' first wife. And his family, his daughter and 3 sons, only found out about this secret marriage from a reporter. And this marriage took place at a time when interracial marriage was illegal in most of the country. There was a family gathering where the children confronted their father, because we know that the children wrote letters about that meeting, but didn't specify as much I had hoped that they would specify. So I imagined that what we call a family intervention, because they were very upset that it was done secretly. Rosetta particularly felt it was an insult to her mother, and they felt that his demand that they accept Helen as his second wife, equal to his other wife, was just simply beyond the pale for them. Then there are some names that you are perhaps more familiar with. William Lloyd Garrison, who was the writer of The Liberator, a newspaper in Boston. Garrison essentially mentored and sponsored Frederick Douglass, and he has said at one point, Frederick Douglass is the lion amongst us. He knew that Douglass was the best. And they traveled together, but then Frederick, in the course of his own development as an intellectual, changed his mind about the Constitution, that the Constitution called by Garrison a covenant with death and an agreement with hell, and Garrison publicly attacked him, creating the most virulent controversy in the history of American abolition, and also accused Douglass of changing his mind because of the white woman, Julia Griffiths, living in his house. Because Douglass changed his mind. Garrison never forgave Frederick, called him an apostate, called him a traitor. Was he? Then you'll meet John Brown, another character. I didn't know, for example, that John Brown, who's very well known because of the attack on Harper's Ferry, came to Rochester many times and lived in the house, the South Avenue house, with Frederick Douglass, and had long conversations. And Douglass supported Brown's plan to have slave uprisings throughout the country by secretly raising arms and passing on those arms to pockets of slaves throughout the country, and that one day they would all rise up and gather together and overthrow slavery. Frederick supported that plan because he began to realize that slavery was not going to end with political change, especially after the Supreme Court decision of 1857, when the Supreme Court declared that black people had no rights, none, and were not American citizens and never could be because they were inferior. Also, the Supreme Court's decision, Dred Scott, as it's called, declared that slavery could go into the territories and the federal government had no right to stop it. Well, disillusioned by this decision, Frederick was more and more attracted to John Brown's plan until 1859, when John Brown met with him in Pennsylvania and said, I have a different plan. We're going to attack the federal arsenal in Harper's Ferry, which is now in West Virginia. But if you go to West Virginia to see Harper's Ferry, you can see why Frederick Douglass said, this is suicide. No, I'm not going with you. And Frederick Douglass was implicated in Harper's Ferry because John Brown brought letters from Frederick and other people who supported him. So he had to become a fugitive again, because the state of Virginia declared him to be a traitor, and Frederick Douglass had to move, once again, go to England. So it was question, was John Brown a fanatic? Was he a madman? Was he a liar? Or was he a hero that hastened the start of the Civil War? John Brown called his friend a coward. And that deeply offended Frederick, but he still praised Garrison's role in the ultimate outcome of the Civil War, coming within a year. And then there is Abraham Lincoln, who appears in the novel 3 times, because there are only 3 times that Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln met. But those three events were very transformative. And Douglass was a very harsh critic of President Lincoln at the start of the war, because the war was not a war for the abolition of slavery. The war at that time was a war to save the Union. And many, many generals and soldiers openly said that they would not fight with black soldiers because of their own bigotries that were shared by Lincoln, who himself openly told a group of leaders in the summer of 1862 that black people needed to leave the country because he said their presence in America caused the war. This infuriated Douglass, and he went to see Lincoln to talk about what he had said. And that's when he met. And he went unannounced and showed up in the White House. And when President Lincoln found that Frederick Douglass was there, he got him into the Oval Office before all the other people in the room, which created quite a stir. You can just imagine. But it changed Douglass, because he met a man with whom he disagreed, but he could see that Abraham Lincoln was a man of character, was a man of thought. And after he left that encounter, he was persuaded that Lincoln would end slavery, and Lincoln eventually did. However, if you read the Emancipation Proclamation, you will note that the Emancipation Proclamation only applied to states in rebellion. And there were 4 states that were not. So that meant Maryland and the 3 other states still could have slavery. Eventually, Lincoln needed black soldiers because the Union was losing the war. And he offered a preliminary emancipation, hoping that the seceding states would return to the Union under the threat of emancipation, but they didn't. And so he offered the proclamation in January of 1863, and Douglass was there in Boston celebrating that emancipation proclamation. And then he met with Lincoln again because Lincoln wanted to meet with Frederick in the hopes that Frederick would be a part of the call for arms, that is, to sign up black men to now fight for the Union cause. So he, and 2 of his sons eventually enlisted. One son was in the 54th Massachusetts, a very famous black unit that fought in the South. Douglass became so impressed by Lincoln that when Lincoln was assassinated, he was devastated and called him one of the great Americans. Here in Rochester, when after Lincoln was assassinated, Douglass went to a memorial here, and he planned just simply to sit in the audience, but the audience began to chant his name, Douglass, Douglass, Douglass. And he came up to the podium and he gave one of the most moving eulogies I've ever read. And fortunately, this spontaneous speech was recorded because a man was there writing it all down. So we know what Douglass said that day. And essentially, he talked about this death being a signal that we could come together as brothers and sisters, as Americans, because this was a man who sacrificed his life for that vision of racial unity, because Lincoln had changed his mind about the war, and you can see that change in the second inaugural address. And a few days later, President Lincoln, and Douglass, by the way, was at that inaugural, heard it, and so was John Wilkes Booth. But he was invited to, he went to the White House for the reception and saw Lincoln again. Lincoln, a few days later, invited him to tea, but Douglass declined the invitation because he had a commitment to giving a talk, and he never disappointed audiences waiting for him. He regretted that later because Lincoln was assassinated 3 days later. But he was essential in Douglass's life. And those are the characters of which there are so many more. And by the time I finished the book, because I was committed to the idea of giving backstories for every character, the novel was over 900 pages. And my publisher said, I want to publish this book, but you have to make some changes. You have to, I ended the novel when he went back to Maryland in the 1870s, and did not talk about his latter life, especially his later life with his second wife, Helen, and my publisher wanted that to be a part of the book. So that meant I had to cut earlier parts, and that was very, very challenging for me. To cut whole chapters and whole characters out in order to accommodate this expectation. But that's what authors need to do if you wish to have your books accepted. And my book even had to change its title. The original title was North Star Rising. North Star is a symbol of freedom, and I saw Frederick as a rising star in the firmament of great people. And my publisher liked the novel, that title, but she called me and said, but the marketers are saying that no one will know what the book is about. And so she said, how about Frederick Douglass? I said, okay, why not? Lots of novels are named after the main characters, David Copperfield, Jane Eyre, Oliver Twist. So I didn't I didn't find that objectionable. She also said, why not have a copy of Frederick's photograph, of a photograph of Frederick Douglass on the cover, but not black and white photograph, as you suggested, because it will suggest that this is a biography or another work of nonfiction. So let's have that photograph colorized and modernized, and that's what you see here. This was done by a contemporary artist, and it is a cover that I really liked because it really emphasizes not only his handsome features, but his imposing personality and also his biraciality. Because some images of Douglass give the impression that he was dark-skinned, and he was not. He was fair-skinned, and the photographs of the latter part of his career show that. Meanwhile, the book came out, and it is before you. And as a closing, I want to first to read part from my book, and also just explain to you why I feel that Frederick Douglass is such an important figure in the history of not only Rochester, but the country. Because I feel that we all should know about Frederick Douglass. We all should see him as our hero, of whatever background, of whatever color, whatever class, because he represents the best in us. Even with his flaws, he represents the best in us, because he was so passionate about freedom and justice for all of us. So let me read to you a passage of an incident that he describes in one of his editorials about an event that took place regarding his daughter, Rosetta. When he came to Rochester, schools were segregated. And he, in fact, because of that, he had his daughter tutored by two famous white abolitionists named the Mott sisters. And the Mott sisters tutored her, and she was very smart. And then when Frederick moved to Rochester, he found a school that was willing to take her. Then one day, he says, "Are things going well at Miss Tracy's?" asked Frederick, having been out of town for a few days since her admission to the school. He was still pleased that Rosetta, prepared well by the Mott sisters, had passed her entrance exams with perfect scores. "Papa, I get along pretty well, Papa, but Miss Tracy..." She kept her head down as she examined her father for clues to his disposition and possible reaction. "But maybe I shouldn't say, because I know it is good for me to be there," replied Rosetta. "Please tell me. Don't worry about telling me the truth." Rosetta sighed. Then her words came in a rush, as if they had to be spoken as quickly as possible to be faced. "Miss Tracy doesn't allow me to go into the room with the other girls because I'm colored." "What do you say?" Rosetta stepped back. "I'm sorry, Papa, but I thought..." "No, no, no, no," he said, rushing to her, pressing her close to him for the first time in a long time, and hiding his own face, puffed with rage. "It's not your fault. Just tell me what you mean, please." He waited, releasing his hold on her and allowing her to step back and look up at him. Rosetta started to cry. "I tried to not let it bother me, but she makes me go into a room all by myself, and I get my lessons there alone all day." "Why didn't you tell me?" Rosetta wilted, as if she were the person at fault, and stepped back, her eyes to the floor once more. Frederick realized his mistake at once and gently pulled her into his embrace again. "No, no, 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 it's not your fault. This should not have happened to you or anyone else. I'm glad you told me, and I'll do something to stop this from continuing. Miss Tracy can't treat you this way. She never said that this would be her practice, and we would not have sent you there if we knew she would do this. I'll see Miss Tracy tomorrow morning. Frederick lifted her face to his and added, don't worry, I will see to it that you be treated like the rest. When he told Anna about Rosetta's treatment, she asked wearily, what are you going to do about it? Should I withdraw her? Asked Frederick. We can't allow her to be graded this way. Then you have your answer, replied Anna. But I will insist on a change even when I withdraw her. This can't continue. Do Miss Tracy own that school or just runs it? Asked Anna. Why do you ask? It just might be her boss's rule. And if she wants the job, she'll have to do what they tell her. Well, I have to start somewhere, and I will start with her. Just take Rosetta out. No, not yet, Frederick said. Frederick spent a restless night imagining his confrontation with Lucilia Tracy, who had accepted his money and welcomed Rosetta to her school. Miss Tracy had even said that it was her honor to have the daughter of Frederick Douglass as a pupil, never mentioning separate instructions for Rosetta, the only black student. He imagined a dramatic but short confrontation, Miss Tracy capitulating at once to his civil wrath. He marched to Miss Tracy's the next morning, leaving Rosetta at home. As he approached the school, he could feel his anger rise, threatening a loss of control. He took deep breaths. He would not raise his voice, but Miss Tracy would regret her presumption dearly. A servant announced him, and he found Miss Tracy, a thin, graying woman, primly dressed in black at her desk. As if prepared for this confrontation, she spoke calmly. Please sit down, Mr. Douglass, and I will explain the situation. Please do, since I pay the same tuition as everyone else. Objectively, she explained, when I decided to accept Rosetta, the Board of Trustees did not know about it, but when I informed the board, it opposed me, telling me that I had acted improperly. The board said that I would have to keep her separate if she were to stay. As the headmistress of the trustee school and as their employee, I could not ignore their ruling. I could not. You know how I feel about anti-slavery, Mr. Douglass. I have always been a strong supporter of the cause of colored people. And because I am, I thought it best to keep Rosetta away from the other girls. In time, I thought in a term or two or three, their prejudices might be overcome. Their prejudices, snapped Frederick, leaning forward ever so slightly. You have only talked of the trustees so far. And besides, madam, how can the students' prejudice, if they have any, be overcome if they never see her? Sir, she replied, they do reflect the views of their parents. Frederick stood. Madam, I want to know directly from the other students if they object to my daughter being in their classroom. Miss Tracy smiled dimly. Victory was hers, for surely one dimpled bigot could be found in the group. It continues, but I'll leave it there. In that scene, all the girls, all of them are asked, do they want to have Rosetta Douglass in their classroom? And all of them said yes, which startled Miss Tracy, who then said, okay, yes, but you have to get permission from your parents. And they went home, and all of them, save one, got permission. And that rattled Frederick Douglass to such a degree, he pulled her daughter out of the school and then wrote an editorial blasting the man who was identified, Henry Warner, as the man who caused his daughter to not be educated with other children. So Frederick Douglass was very direct and confrontational about injustice. He knew that in New York, where most places were segregated, he still would try to go in into restaurants, into libraries, just to create a scene, to call attention to the injustice. He would often walk the streets with his English friends, and sometimes his white friends, and he was attacked openly and publicly in Battery Park, New York, and other places. But he would not back down. So when you see posters and photos that look very imposing, that was very deliberate on Frederick Douglass's part. Don't mess with me. That was the message that he wanted, and that was the message he conveyed in the way he dressed, the way he looked. You rarely see him smiling, but you will know that he's a man to be reckoned with. I find it absolutely astonishing that this little boy, who for the first 6 years of his life didn't know he was a slave, eventually became the Marshal of the District of Columbia, advised presidents between Abraham Lincoln and Grover Cleveland, who invested in property here in Rochester and Washington, D.C., and became a very wealthy man. And so wealthy, he was able to buy an estate of 15 acres overlooking Washington, D.C. And in Washington, there was a home that was surrounded by cedar trees, and he called that estate Cedar Hill. And that's where he lived for the remainder of his days. And eventually his daughter Rosetta, who was still living here in Rochester, moved to Washington, and all of his children were there. And the interesting thing about that is that Anna Murray Douglass wanted to be buried in Washington, D.C., and it was a hope of hers that all of her children would be buried there too. However, many people don't know that after Frederick Douglass died, he left all of his properties to Helen Pitts. And he also left the estate to her. The children objected, went to court, and lost. But they secretly, Anna Douglass was buried in Washington, but secretly they had her moved, her body exhumed and moved to Hope Cemetery here in Rochester, because their youngest daughter, Annie, was buried in Hope Cemetery. So she was buried in Hope Cemetery. And Helen Pitts decided that the house, which the children wanted to have sold because of the profit, she decides that house, she's going to give that house to the National Park Service. And now it's part of the whole system of the Park Service so that people can visit, because she wanted that house to be a memorial to Frederick Douglass. And when she died, she also was buried in Rochester alongside Frederick Douglass, who's here in Rochester. And so at Hope Cemetery, which I'm visiting for the very first time tomorrow, I will see this burial site where Anna Douglass is on one side and Helen Pitts is on the other, with Frederick Douglass in the center. I think it's a fitting symbol of the life of interracial harmony to which he was committed. But I would like to end with just reading a few lines from what he had to say that says why words are so powerful, because he himself had the ability to take language and stir people to accept a more open vision of America, a more just, a more equal vision. He believed in America. That's why he came back after he was purchased by his English friends. And he wanted a newspaper that would openly declare this vision. That's what the North Star is about. And he was here in Rochester, here, publishing that newspaper until his house was burned down in 1872. And he moved to Washington because the police here in Rochester, unfortunately, were not willing to investigate the possibility of arson, which Douglass was convinced was the reason why his house was burned down. So he left Washington, and yet I am very pleased that Rochester has embraced the legacy of Frederick Douglass. And I think it's not only because he was here, because his words stir us to see ourselves as Americans in the best way. He said, in words that inspire and challenge us. Right is of no sex. Without struggle, there is no progress. What is the 4th of July to the American slave? Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did and it never will. It's easier to build strong children to repair a broken man. I will unite with anybody to do right. The white man's happiness cannot be purchased by the black man's misery. The cause of humanity is one the world over. Human rights are eternal, universal, and indestructible. Agitate, agitate, agitate. Those words and so many more are why I'm here today, talking about Frederick Douglass and explaining in my limited way why I wrote a novel that I hopefully will introduce so many more about this incredible, remarkable, imperfect, but very inspiring man. He is a gift to us, and that he came out of the Eastern Shore as a slave and made himself who he became is a testament not only to his will and ambition, but a testament to all the people who helped him on this remarkable journey. Thank you for listening to me, and I would gladly take any questions that you might have. Okay.
Why you were inspired to write this, I mean, and from a fictional point, that was
Yes.
the other.
Okay.
Why from a fictional?
Yes, yes. Thank you for asking that question. I addressed it briefly before you arrived, but I would reiterate it because it's a question I'm always asked. Why did you write a novel? Why didn't you, and I can tell you that I wrote a novel because I love historical fiction. That's how I became attracted to history, by reading historical novels. And as a history teacher, I in fact used historical novels in my advanced placement history classes to make comparisons between history and novels, and to show that historical novels are very effective in introducing students and adult readers to the feel of a time and a place. And so also, but the reason why I chose fiction over biography is because biographies require documentation. You have to have references to specific documents to say this is what happened. And you cannot have dialogue. You cannot have make claims without documented proof, whereas novels solidly based on the facts can give a sense of the character and of the time in ways which I don't think history can do. And however, in defending history books, not textbooks, those are deadening, but in history books, well written, you get a sense of the drama of history, the story of drama. And so that's why when we read great historical novels, we, I think, get even more interested in what happened. For example, Stephen Crane never heard a shot during the Civil War, yet he wrote the greatest novel about the Civil War that I know of, Red Badge of Courage. Leo Tolstoy did not live during the Napoleonic Wars, but one of the great novels about that period is War and Peace. Shakespeare, of course, did not live during the wars of the Lancasters and the Yorks, but he saw that history gave an opportunity for him to address the issues of power and control and family conflict. And so he wrote his plays based on those stories of history. And so that's what I wanted to do. And so also, one of the major reasons why I was attracted to the historical novel is that I'm a frustrated playwright. I love dialogue, and I love characters talking. And so in the book, you'll have most of the characters interacting. And privately, Anna and his wife, Anna and Douglass and his friends, arguments between Frederick Douglass and his not only his enemies, but some of his own colleagues. For example, he and Henry Highland Garnett, who was a very prominent minister, hate each other throughout their lives. And yet I wanted to explore why these two preeminent black men during that time did not get along. And we know they had things to say about each other, but I wanted that story to be dramatized in scenes that I know took place because they describe them. But I wanted to dramatize those events, not narrate them. And Douglass, for example, even when he describes his meetings with Lincoln, he does not have dialogue. He just has summaries of what each other said. And I think as a writer, I wanted to make it much more specific. And that's why I wrote a historical novel rather than a biography. Now, again, remember what it says, Frederick Douglass, a novel. I am not claiming this is definitive, that this is the only way it happened. This is what I imagined it to happen. And I was at a bookstore on the Eastern Shore a couple of days ago. Yes, make it real. But the manager of the bookstore said, I read this book, it's really good, and I was looking to see if Mr. Morrison made any mistakes. And she said, he made none, and she announced that to the group, because I wanted to be scrupulous about the record. I wanted to show that the book is based on the events that happened, and only that. I could have said that he met Lincoln more than 3 times, but he didn't. And because of the research that professors have done and throughout the past few years, we now know where Frederick Douglass was for almost every day between 1841 and when he became a public anti-slavery lecturer, and 1895 when he died. So I used that chronology as the basis of writing the story, and I did not change the chronology of events or where he was where he was. And so that was an acknowledgement that I did my research well. But what I really wanted to do is to get into the inside story, and especially of those characters of whom we know very little, like his first wife, Anna Douglass, who several readers of my book have said is the best character in the book. A historical novelist who is one of my favorite historical novelists, named Margaret George, who I had the privilege of meeting a few days ago. She's written books about Henry VIII, Mary Queen of Scotland, Cleopatra, Helen of Troy. And she said to me that she missed Anna Douglass every time she left the scene and looked forward to her return. And that, for me, was a tribute to the power of my imagination about Anna, because there's only a short pamphlet about Anna's life written by her daughter after her mother died. And it gives very little about her inner life, but we got details about where she was from and how she raised the children and things like that. The rest just came out of my head. And I am pleased that someone as esteemed as her said she came alive to her. And I hope to you as a reader, you will feel the same. What was that?
Just as you said, you get the feeling of the time.
Yes, yes.
What it was like for folks.
And that's what I want as a history teacher as well as a writer. I want people to feel what it was like to be alive in the 19th century, especially during the time when the country was falling apart and eventually led to war. And then what happened after there was an attempt at reconciliation during Reconstruction, and witnessing success to such a degree that white people in the South decide that those successors had to be undermined and destroyed by the Ku Klux Klan and create a complete system of Jim Crow. So many of the issues that Frederick Douglass dealt in his time are still unresolved issues in our time.
Exactly. I was going to say, that was one of my next questions, is what do you think today he would think of our world today?
What he would think of what's happening in our world today, it would be for him proof that the work still must continue. That there would be, I think, a level of disappointment, but there would also be, okay, let's do the work. Let's continue with it. And on the day he died in 1895, he was at a women's rights convention. So he never tired of challenging the system and standing up for what he thought was right. He was a he was a warrior. He was a warrior for justice for everybody. Many people, for example, don't know that here, that in the country, when there was a movement against immigrants, particularly Chinese immigrants who had helped to build the transcontinental railroad and not allowed to be in pictures, he called that out in a speech and said, this country is a composite country. This country is a country of immigrants, and that we are better for it. And he would be very dismayed that this language of hate against immigrants is still the language of so many people. But he would speak to, again, that vision of the nation as one nation of many, many people. And he would be, I think, in the networks that are available now, calling it out and denouncing it and saying, we can do better. We can do better. Because he believed in America, even though America did not love him. He believed in America, and he never gave up on America. And that's why, for me, he's such an inspiring figure. I mean, when you think about it, this little boy, you know, and went through a lot, but he made his life significant. He made it important because he cared enough about freedom. And eventually, freedom was freedom not for just black people, but freedom for everyone who was oppressed. And I can honestly tell you that one of the sad developments in this life of this amazing man is that as an older spokesperson, he was challenged and then severely criticized by a younger generation of reformers. He was called an Uncle Tom. He was called old and irrelevant. And that pattern of an older generation being rejected by a younger generation of reformers has played out with other figures in American history, like Martin Luther King. But that is almost inevitable. But eventually, I think, if there are people who are advocates like you and me and others who see that happening, will say, wait a minute, we are here able to criticize because he did the work. And so there should be gratitude that he laid that foundation so that we can even criticize him as insufficiently standing up for what he needed to do. Because at one point, Mr. Douglas was so eager to get jobs by the federal government, he started criticizing less and less. Because, you know, again, when your boss is giving you a job, do you denounce your boss? And eventually, he began to see that was not the way to go. And after he lost one of his federal jobs, that's when he was free. He said, I'm now free to speak what I should have done. You know, and we all are complicated. We all make decisions that we may regret. But, you know, that's the human story. You know, that we are not everything we say that we want to be. We're mysteries to even ourselves. But our job is to be empathetic towards all human beings, I think. Hilary Mantel, who is one of my heroines of historical writing, she's written historical novels about the Tudor era, but she's given lectures about what it means to be a novelist, and what she says is, we should study what we don't know, so that we can expand our capacity for empathy and connection. And when we do that, and we learn about other people and other societies and other times, we become more broad in our acceptance of the diversity and the unity of the human family. And that's my role too. The commonality, that's what I'm saying. That everyone is trying to become better. Most people are trying to become better. Most people are struggling. Most people are confused about a number of areas of different things. But we still are we should be tolerant and more accepting of the struggle that we're all in. Yes, sir. No, when I was giving my talk, it was John Brown who called him a coward. Yes.
And was wondering, Harriet Tubman, was there any talk about her being a hero and him being a coward? Was he ever juxtaposed to
Interesting, interesting. Uh, that question of the heroism of Harriet Tubman, he addressed in a letter that he wrote about her. They never met, even though they both were from Maryland. And what he, in his letter, she was collecting tribute. He wrote a letter because she asked him to write a letter about her life, because she was collecting material about her life. And so she reached out to Frederick Douglass, and he wrote one of the most moving tributes to Harriet Tubman that you would encounter. In fact, you can find a reproduction of that letter in the State House of Maryland in Annapolis, where there are, on one side, inside a major room of the State House, is a statue of Harriet Tubman, and on the other side, a statue of Frederick Douglass. And in between is this statement that he said about her. And he said that you are far greater than I because you went back to Maryland in the night, endangering your life again and again and again. And I didn't do that. And so you should be recognized for your, yes, and that's what she said. He said, I had a different role. And my role was in the public sphere, and yours was in a private, quiet, but it should be recognized for what it was. Now again, I would have loved to have them met, but I did not make them meet because that would have been contrary to the historical record.
You know, his voice at that time, you know, we don't know where, I mean, he made it known to the world that this is injustice.
Right.
Right? She worked in a little bit different way.
Yeah, she worked in a way that was very private, one-on-one, and yes, bringing people back from Maryland and making it into freedom. But she was like Frederick. She was like, don't mess with me. For example, there's an account when one guy got so afraid, and she said, she pulled out her gun and said, you better stop, or you're going to die right here now.
She said, you're going to go or you're not.
That's right.
Take you one. You're going to die here at my gun.
Right.
Or you're going to die here.
Yeah, because he was threatening because he was threatening the whole project by screaming and yelling, and and she said, do you want to die here or not? And so she was another one of these very formidable people that just would not say no. And he did it in his own way, and as a result we have examples of courage that inspires me. I could not honestly say that I don't know if I would have risen to that level. I mean, to me, that is just the times that he faced, the possibility of being lynched. He got caught trying to start a school. He started a school for slaves and was teaching them how to read, and that was busted up by his enslaver and the other townspeople. And then he got caught trying to escape, and they dragged him across Talbot County and was put in jail, and a mob showed up and was screaming for his, for his life. And suddenly, he was sent back to Baltimore by his master, by the man who owned him. Why? What is that about? And those are the kinds of things I'm trying to explore. What people do that surprise us, inspires us, challenges us. And these two figures are now, particularly in Maryland, recognized as iconic, special people. Yes, that's right. So here are these two figures. Isn't it? I think it's somewhere near Albany. Auburn. Oh, yes, Auburn, New York. That's where it's interesting that both these two Marylanders ended up living and are buried in the same area of New York State.
It's only about,
Yeah. Yeah. Any other questions or comments?
I want to say that as an Afro-American, I want to thank you for publishing, making this book available. It should be in some of our high schools.
Well, that is my hope. Right here on the top, it says, this should be required reading. Margaret George said that. And it's my hope that it will be in high schools and in colleges. And I'm going to be on this journey because I was a history teacher. Mm-hmm.
But I went to school at some point after high school, and I had a little, the narrative,
Yes, that book, his first book. It's a really short book. That's right. That's right. Narrative of the Life.
I don't remember learning as much in high school. I learned really more in my own time.
Yeah.
Reading the libraries today, and have been for some time for me, a real source of education.
Yes.
I feel that I got miseducated.
Well, I apologize for that. I wish you were in my classroom where I taught history because,
You don't get, you learn so little about African American history. Really true.
well, sadly, there are some states that feel that African American history is irrelevant for students to learn. And
I'm a 60s kid, man.
well, so am I.
For me, I really, I feel that it was in a place at a time. It's the same way when you go up.
Yeah.
You visit the house.
Yeah.
From how to schedule that, but you go site, you feel the spirit of the ancestors. Sometimes I like get up there.
Yes. Well, libraries have been special places for me. As a child, they were a refuge. They were just a source of all. That's why books are so special, because it connects you with people in different lands and different times. And it takes you to places. And Douglass recognized that. Douglass heard speeches that were being given by children on the streets of Baltimore. They were attending school, and and recitation was very important in 19th century American schools. And he heard these white boys reciting speeches like that come from American history. Give me liberty, give me death, all these. And eventually he said, where did this come from? And they said, it comes from a book of a collection of speeches. And it's called The Columbian Orator. And so he said, tell me about this little book. And so eventually he decides to raise some money from that he earns from doing little jobs in Baltimore. And 12 years old, he goes to this store and asks for this little book. And the owner of the bookstore says, "Oh, that's way back there. It's gathering dust. No, you can have it. No one wants to buy this thing." That book was the source of his education about how to give speeches, and he memorized many of those speeches in that book, including the speeches that many of us know. But I want to tell you, he kept that book for his entire life, and is now in the house on display in Cedar Hill in Washington, D.C. And it shows how books can change the world. It certainly changed him. And he wanted everyone to know. That's why he wrote books. That's why he always quoted scripture from the Bible. He wanted people to know that language matters, and what you say and how you say it is really, really important. Yeah, and so he loved libraries. It was sad to him that when he escaped, that when he went to New York and went to Boston and to Rochester, and he discovered he had no access to libraries because he was black. And so he became committed to schools that were integrated. He became committed to access for everyone but look how long it took. It was not, until 1864. 1964, 65 was discrimination in public places, illegal throughout the country. Now, ironically, his friend Charles Sumner got passed a civil rights act. He was from Massachusetts, and he eventually got a civil rights act that banned discrimination in public places. That was in 1874, and the Supreme Court turned it over and said that was illegal, and that segregation was fine. And it was finally formalized in Plessy versus Ferguson. And so 100 years passed before the reality of public discrimination was addressed and changed legally. But still are things still in work. The ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment, has not yet been passed. And he would be on that one for sure, because he, as he said, right is of no sex. So he is an eternal warrior. When there was injustice, he's calling it out. And so he would be doing this even today, because there's enough for him to challenge and confront and question and inspire us to say, no, this is not right, we can do better. Anything else that you would like to raise before we end our afternoon? I want to say thank you again for coming. I want to say thank you to the Rochester Public Library. I want to say thank you to the audience who is live streaming this. And it also will be on Facebook. And so I know that my words will be going forth from a small audience to a much larger audience. And I even ask, can I come back? I mean, I would, especially during February, which is not only the month of Frederick Douglass's birth, but of course, as you know, it's Black History Month, and it's an opportunity to reconnect people with the life of this remarkable man who himself did not know his own birth date. He thought he was born in 1817, and he discovered he never learned that he was actually born in 1818. But we know that he was born in 1818 because a historian discovered on the Eastern Shore a list of all the Baileys that had been written down by the Aaron Anthony family, with the names, and going back to the 1700s, and all the names of all the Baileys, including Frederick, whose full name was Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey. And there it is in that document, February 1818. He never found that document, so he himself was still someone in search of the truth of his life. But fortunately, because of historians and other people, we know much more about Frederick and his family. And for me, that's also been what I've been trying to celebrate, is the people in his life that impacted him in ways, small and big, that made him who he was. Anything else? Well, thank you. I hope, and if you read my book and you like it, tell me, write a review and put it on Amazon, because that impacts the algorithm is impacted in terms of access to in searches. If you type in Frederick Douglass, then if you write a positive review, that tends to get more immediate result of the novel. And also, if you don't, you can also let me know that if you don't like the book, let me know why, so that, because I can improve my next novel, which is about another slave, James Hemings, who was a chef of Thomas Jefferson. And I was excited about discovering this genius who learned French in 3 years, became a master chef while he was in Paris with Jefferson, and then returned to America and returned to enslavement. So that story is something I wanted to explore. Why did he do that? And what happened to him when he did that in both Paris and in America? And because Jefferson loved French food, and he wanted this young man to learn how to cook French food. And so that's the story that I'm working on next. And I hope that you will continue to support this late development of a writer's career. Hopefully, it's never too late, never too late. Okay, thank you so much.
So much to offer.
Oh,
Don't
well, thank you so much.
today's culture.
If there's anything, if anything I may be an example of, it's never too late to follow your dream. You know, it took 40 years, but here it is. Never too late. Well, thank you. Thank you, and have a good afternoon. And thank you for coming.
Now, how do you have an email or?
Yes, Sidney Morrison.